So have you ever felt like maybe a professional AC tech was not exactly honest with you, or maybe you feel like they flat out lied to you about the condition of your capacitor and that it needs to be replaced? That absolutely did happen to me. So in this video, I'm going to tell you exactly what they said to me. I'm also going to show you just how easily these can be replaced. But more importantly, I'm going to show you exactly how they tried to prove it to me. So I'm going to share all of that with you, and then also how these are supposed to be tested. So let's go ahead and jump right in. All right, so the first thing we always need to do before we do anything with the AC unit is we want to make sure that there's no power going to it. So you pretty much always will have a disconnect next to your AC unit somewhere. If we flip this open, so for me personally, all I need to do is I just need to pull that disconnect out. Now I can flip it upside down and just put it back in, and there won't be power flowing through it, but it's always safest to just put it in on top of the box, and you know you won't have an issue. All right, so now I want to locate the panel cover for my AC unit, and the way to get this off, all I need to do is remove these 4 screws at the top and the bottom, and I will do that using this 5/16 driver that's made by Klein. All right, so now that I've got those 4 screws removed, now I can remove the panel off of the AC unit. All right, so now I've got the disconnect pulled, I got the panel off. I want to confirm that that power is in fact off. So I'm going to take my multimeter, I'm going to switch it over here to voltage, alternating current, and in order to test this, I want to test these incoming wires that are coming from my disconnect into the contactor here. So I'm going to take each one of those probes, I'm going to put one on each of those screws. As you can see, we're getting 0.5, 0.6 volts, which is essentially saying this is dead, there is no voltage there, but I am testing from hot to hot. So then what I want to do is I want to test each individual side of the contactor. So what I want to do is then I want to take one probe, touch it to the ground, and take the other probe and touch it to the T1 or the left side of the contactor on that screw, and there's no voltage there. But now let's test the T2 or the right side of the contactor, and it's showing 0.058, which again is showing that the power is in fact off. For the most part, we've just got 3 main components underneath of this AC unit's panel. We got a circuit board up here. This down here is called the contactor, and this over here is what we're after. This is the capacitor. And this capacitor right here is actually the one that I was told needed to be replaced, even though it was in perfect condition. This was probably about 7 or 8 months ago. But on this label is where our key information is. And the biggest ones that we want to pay attention to are these numbers right here. It says 75. And what that is it's splitting up between the hermetic terminal, which is for your compressor, and the fan terminal. And we'll get into those. Those are up here on top. But those are giving you the ideal microfarad readings to know whether or not this capacitor is still good or it needs to be replaced. And then if you look over here to the right, it says plus or minus 6%. So when we take our reading, we want to be within 6%, whether that's 6% high or 6% low. And as long as it's within that 6%, then the capacitor is still in good and working condition. All right, so big thing before we do anything as far as touching the top of this capacitor, removing wires, touching wires, we want to make sure that this capacitor is fully discharged. Now this should happen naturally as the unit shuts down. It should discharge through the windings, but it is not impossible to where these can still hold a charge. And if you were to touch these terminals up on top without it being discharged, then you're going to get quite a shock. So the way that we're going to go about doing this, again, I'm going to take my 5/16 Klein driver, take the metal portion of their screwdriver or their nut driver, holding on to the plastic and rubber handle, and then they will take that metal portion and they will connect the 2 terminals from common to hermetic, or it will say Herm, H-E-R-M on top. Then they'll go from common to the fan, which is the terminal that's in on the back here. And then I always like to just go back and forth a couple times just to make sure that it is in fact discharged. All right, so I now know that this is completely discharged. I can now start testing and working on these terminals here, but I'm just gonna leave it exactly like this because this is exactly how the AC tech that came out, this is how he tested it. And I'll show you why this is wrong in just a moment. All right, so I've got my multimeter here. So I've got it set over here to where it can read microfarads and nanofarads. So I'm going to take one of those probes, I'm going to touch it to the common side, and then I'm going to take the other one, and I'm going to connect it to the Herm terminal. And as you can see, it's saying OL. What that means is open line. It's not able to detect anything. And this is what the multimeter was reading when he tried to prove to me that the capacitor needed to be replaced. So if this actually was the case, then yeah, the capacitor definitely needs to be replaced. But let's go ahead and check the common to the fan terminal. So I'm just going to put that on that common terminal. I'm going to try and put my probe then through to the back to the fan terminal. It's reading nanofarads first again. And again, we're getting open line. So yeah, according to the tester, this capacitor definitely needs to be replaced. So what was done wrong here? Now, whether it was done purposely or not, I'll let you be the judge. I find it a little bit hard to believe that he doesn't know how to properly test a capacitor. So now let's go ahead and remove all the wires, and I'll show you what the reading is then. Now, I always advise before removing the spade connectors from the terminals or removing the wires from the terminals to take a picture of how they currently are sitting so that when we go to reconnect them, we know exactly where each wire goes. Again, there are 3 of them: common, Herm, and then in the back, which you can't hardly see, there is the fan terminal. All right, so now that I've taken that picture, now I'm just gonna remove all of my wiring from the terminals. All right, so as you can see, still the same capacitor. Now what we're looking for, again, this first reading, I'm gonna go from common to hermetic. We're looking for 70 microfarads, or within 6% high or low of that 70 microfarads. So I'll go ahead, show you the screen, connect one probe to the common, the second probe to the Herm. It's moving over to microfarads, and there you can see it's reading out at 68.9. So that is well within the 6% plus or minus that this capacitor can be, and it's in very good and working condition. We're really not even close to that 6% drop yet. All right, so now I'm going to take that probe off the Herm. I'm going to leave the one probe still connected to the common terminal, and now I'm going to go ahead and push that probe back to the fan terminal. Now we're looking for 5 microfarads, and it's reading 4.96. So almost perfect, still very much well within the range of 6%. So this capacitor, even though I was being told it needed to be replaced, it is nowhere near needing to be replaced. All right, so this is going to be important. So we're going to take a little bit closer look at this capacitor right here. I actually did have to replace this one because this one did go bad. But as you can see down here at the bottom, it still says 70 and 5 microfarads. Again, the numbers can be within plus or minus 6%. Now, some physical things that you can observe from the outside without having to test it to see if possibly the capacitor is bad is if you see any kind of fluid leaking out of the capacitor, that's a bad sign. It should not be leaking out of the capacitor. Another thing to look out for is if you look up here at the top and sometimes down at the bottom, but a lot of times when these are going bad or are bad, there will start to be like a hill that starts coming up, like a mound, and it will have a mushrooming effect, and you'll start seeing your terminals kind of pointing out at a little bit of an angle because that mound is popping up on the top. If you see those two things, there's a really good chance the capacitor is going bad and needs to be replaced. But in this case, as you can see, it's flat on top, it's flat on the bottom, but this capacitor was still bad. So if it's a dual run capacitor, you're gonna have these 3 terminals, and if we look at the top, usually engraved up here at the top of it, it's going to show exactly what each terminal is. But now, really quickly, let me show you close up how these are tested. So again, our common is down here at the bottom where it says C. So I'm going to go ahead, take one of my probes, put it on the common terminal where there's that C. Then I'm going to take the other probe, connect it to the fan terminal over here to the right, or about 1 o'clock. Going to let it settle out. And as you can see, it's reading 8.46 microfarads. But I guess over the past year of it just sitting in the heat in the garage, it has deteriorated that much more because the fan was not reading out of its limit when I tested it and replaced it. Because again, if we look at the capacitor from the common to the fan, we should be getting within 6% of those 5 microfarads. And at 8 microfarads, that's well above the 6% allowed in order for it to be considered good and in working order. So again, I'll take my one probe, put it on the common terminal, take my second probe, put it on the Herm or hermetic side. And as you can see, the multimeter is just bouncing around at 0. There was even a point where it said open line, and it is not giving us a reading between the common and the Herm at all. So this capacitor is definitely bad. So now I'm going to take a brand new capacitor, but you'll see on this one, it's actually got 4 terminals. There's this orange one over here. This is not very typical. It just comes on some of the other brands, like this one is Amrad. And this orange one is for if you already have a hard start installed on your unit. That is where that would get connected on this particular capacitor. And on this one, when we look at the label, it says 70 plus 5, and it says MFD instead of that microfarad symbol. It actually says MFD for microfarads. And again, depending on the size of your unit, it's not always going to be 70 and 5 microfarads. It might be 40 and 5. It might be 70 and 7.5. The numbers are just going to vary depending on the unit. So again, just make sure you're matching up your numbers. But another thing that is cool about this Amrad brand is if we flip it over here to the back, they show you what this tested out when they sent it out from the factory. So when we test this, we should be fairly close to these numbers here. They can be off by just a little bit. But ultimately, on this one, what we're looking for is, if you see right here, it says plus 10%. So these numbers can be higher by up to 10% when we take our reading, and minus 5%, which means that they can only be down by 5% from 70 and 5 when we take our readings. So I'll just take one of my probes, touch it to common, take the next one, touch it to Herm. And as you can see, we're getting a steady 72.2 microfarads. So it is a little bit higher than the 70 microfarads that this is rated for, but it is well within the 10% that it needs to be. So that is perfect. And if we look here where they tested it coming from the factory, it was 72.4. So very, very close. So now I'm going to test the fan side, common to fan, and it's reading 5.27. So again, just slightly higher than 5, but well within that 10% that it's allowed to be within. And from the factory, they said it was reading at 5.3. So because this is brand new, this is in absolutely perfect condition. This AMRAD brand is manufactured here in the United States. They are very well made capacitors. You can expect to pay anywhere from 3 to 4 times the cost of one of these capacitors that is not made here in the US. Now, will this made in the USA capacitor last longer than the one that's made overseas? I've heard a lot of people say that they do. A lot of AC techs say that these will last longer than the ones that are either made in Mexico or overseas. So you just kind of have to weigh everything out as far as how much more you want to pay for that possible extra longevity and knowing that it's made in the United States. Like always, I'll have links for all of these and in varying sizes, along with all the tools that you've seen and will see in this video. I'll have links for everything down in the description down below, where when you click on them, it'll take you directly to them and you can check them all out for yourself. Let's go ahead, go back out to the unit, and I'll show you just how easily these can be replaced. Now, the way that this is removed in order to replace it is super easy. Generally, there's going to be 1 or 2 screws on one side of the capacitor or the other. This is basically like a band that's holding it in place. So we're going to have to loosen or undo those screws in order to get this capacitor out. And I can easily do that by using a 1/4 inch drive. All right, so it's loose enough now to where this can slide out, but because of the way that my wires are and I don't really want to risk doing any damage to anything, I just always just unscrew the screws all the way and just remove the banding along with the capacitor. That's where then we can take our new capacitor, which this one is the same one because it's perfectly fine, but this is where a new capacitor could be taken, slide it right back into the banding. When I'm replacing these, I personally always like to make sure that my label is facing out so it's easily readable, either by me or somebody else in the future. Then I just place it back in the unit, reinsert my screws, and then tightening them down, holding it all in place. And then at this point, this is where I'd go back to my pictures, looking at where each of the wires went on each of the terminals, and then place each one of those wires in their proper places. I also want to be referring back to my pictures to make sure that I'm replacing the same amount of wires as I removed. And if you don't replace all the wires back to where they're supposed to be, at the very least, your unit is just not going to run correctly and it could possibly cause damage. All right, so now we've got our new or good capacitor wired up and installed. Now all I need to do is replace the panel in on top, reinsert those 4 screws to hold the panel on, and then once that's done, I can then turn the disconnect back on, or the circuit breakers that were turned off, I can turn everything back on, and then just check to make sure that the AC unit starts properly and continues to run properly, and then also check the vents inside to make sure that there's cold air blowing through them. Now, if you found value in this video, then you're definitely going to find value in this video right over here, where I go over some of the top things that a lot of AC companies don't necessarily want you to know about and how they're able to be fixed and tested. But if you know with your background that you're capable of handling it, you can save a lot of money by being able to look out for these things for yourself. If that's of interest to you, all you have to do is click on it. It'll take you directly to it. And I'll catch you all in the next one. See ya.